Thanks, Stephen. And if I can also just say, I'm really, really flattered to be invited back. Glad I didn't sort of offend, behave inappropriately last time. I really enjoyed my time with you all last time. And so, yeah, it's really lovely to be able to join you again this morning. And very keen to make this sort of interactive. I know you guys have got a whole load of insights and got a really well qualified audience. So while I hopefully can provide some input and perspectives, it'd be really great to draw on your insights, questions, and so on. Would be terrific. So what I thought I might just do is maybe do a little bit of a recap on sort of where we got to last time. But really, I thought, in talking to Stephen and praying into this, we thought what we'd really like to explore maybe further is how does our faith play into all these big global issues we're facing, and what might that mean for us sort of personally to ground it a bit more. So that's where we sort of thought we would go. But I think when I spoke to you last time, I talked about these big sort of major global trends that are sort of really transforming society. So the first one, and a lot of it really, I think, is being driven by both the population growth that we're seeing. So we're going from 2.5 billion in 1950 to expecting around about 9 billion by mid-century. So there's huge growth in both global population, but also, of course, living standards with it. So and what we've seen as a result of that is a huge lifting of people's standard of living, particularly in China and elsewhere, over that period of huge economic growth. And we're expecting around about 5.3 billion to be in the middle class by around about 2030. So huge transformation. And I think the issue we're facing is that our current business models, our current economic models, are really generating high amounts of, if you like, waste and emissions as part of that. So that's creating climate change, and it's creating huge amounts of waste. And we're really taking what's often called a kind of take, make, waste business model. So if you look at most things, whether that's obviously things like bottled water, whether that's the cars we drive, that's the sort of the model we're based on, is taking raw materials either out of the ground or out of the biosphere, using it and then throwing it away. That's obviously been the model, dominant model up to now. And now we're really, the chickens are coming home to roost, really. We're starting to see the effects of that writ large as that economic model has been expanded around the globe. And so from a climate change perspective, they reckon we've got around about 10 years left on whether or not we move into often what scientists are calling runaway climate change. So that's really when the effects of climate change, we couldn't stop it even if we wanted to, because a whole series of feedback loops start to kick in that exacerbate and accelerate climate change. And so while we had 10 years and people are talking about the 2020s as the decisive decade, in effect, because of the coronavirus and that governments are now, of course, mobilizing trillions of dollars of investment, really what that's done, and which will lock us in for decades to come, is that really compressed that 10 years into up to 12 months, maybe 18 months. And so we're at a really unique, decisive point in human history where we're effectively deciding the extent to which the planet is livable on for the majority of people. That's really, and so when Dave Attenborough was saying, in the next few years, the decisions we take will impact the next thousands of years, that's what he was kind of getting at. So we really are at a kind of unique period of human history. Meanwhile, inequality is growing, both within and between nations. For example, the average US CEO salary is 168 times the average in the business, and that's gone 90% since 1978, when it was just 12%. And so we've seen a dramatic growth in billionaires over the last 10 years, and so we're seeing real spikes in inequality as well going alongside that. So I think one of the things I guess I want to just kind of share as well, reflect on, is what we're seeing since the pandemic, because what the pandemic clearly seems to have done is put into very sharp relief how interconnected the global system is. Just in time sort of supply chains, and actually the origin of the pandemics came back to our relationship with biodiversity, which it leaked across from various bat species, we think, in live markets in China. And so even that is reflecting our relationship with the natural world. But also I think what it's done is it revealed a lot of the inequalities. So, of course, things like Black Lives Matter, these sorts of issues, is really coming together. The people of the pandemic is not universal. And as somebody once put it, while we're in the same storm, we're not all in the same boat. And so the conversations we're having, I guess, and what we're seeing is an opportunity at a really pivotal point, because I think really there are two scenarios really facing us. The one, which is, I think, still very plausible, is just get back to growth at all costs. You know, whatever that growth is, whether that's high carbon, whatever, let's get back to growth, whatever it takes to get jobs, to get, you know, obviously tax coming in to repay the huge bailout sums. On the other hand, we've got an opportunity to, in this pivotal moment, to really fundamentally reset our economy, the relationship between business, civil society, and government, in order to really put rather than put sticking plasters on lots of the systems that are teetering and fragile, actually to fundamentally fix them. We've got this opportunity. So there's this term you may have come across, kind of build back better, which is being used to describe what that second alternative looks like. And so you've got, for example, the World Economic Forum, which hosts Davos every year, has launched a big reset campaign, which is all about that, calling on global leaders to do that. And their launch was pretty impressive. They had our patron, the Prince of Wales, was there, plus I think he was like the CEO of the World Bank and, you know, the UN and so on and so forth. And I think one of the, signs of opportunity is also how the shifts in capital markets that we're seeing. So I think the capital markets are really waking up initially to the extent of climate risk. So as Mark Carney put it, climate risk equals investment risk. And there was some research done by somebody I know, Bob Eccles, who's a professor over in the US. And he was pointing out they did research of fund managers all over the world, including the biggest fund managers like BlackRock and so on. And what they found was that sustainability, or often, you know, ESG, so looking at environmental, social and governance criteria and investment portfolios, was really top of mind for the CEOs of these investment funds. Because I think they're really seeing not only that they've potentially got huge exposure in their capital portfolios, but also there's a huge opportunity for them if they really angling their portfolios to invest in businesses and industries that have real potential, that are aligned with this future we're facing into, then they're going to have a much more profitable, resilient portfolio. And again, Mark Carney, I think, summarized it well, where he said that really it's about businesses then aligning their strategies with this wider social fundamental shift that's taking place, and the need for that alignment. And he was also reflecting on the difference between the crisis in 2008 and the current crisis. And he was saying that, first of all, what it shows is that systemic risks, you can't wish them away, they're coming. But also that, like a lot of crises, it tends to come from a misalignment in values in terms of what you're actually valuing. As we saw in the sort of capital markets then. And really in the current crisis I think we're going through is, and particularly with climate change, it's around we're not really pricing in and valuing environmental externalities, social and environmental assets and dependencies. We're not pricing those into current capital markets and economic measures sufficiently. And so he was sort of reflecting on that again. And just a sort of final thought on the macro picture is that while you could summarize the pandemic as something that we could say was relatively unlikely or hard to predict, the impact was very large but relatively short term. Whereas I think the reality of the other systemic risks we're facing, particularly climate change and biodiversity loss, in contrast, are highly, to a large extent, predictable. So it's both predictable, it's very high impact, and it's long term, it's over the long term. And so what will be interesting to see is whether or not we are able to respond in a similar way we did under the pandemic, which was really listen to the scientists, take decisive action that is consistent with the level of the systemic challenge that we're facing. So I want to just sort of, I guess, just offer that as a little bit of a kind of recap where we got to last time and bring us up to setting in the context of the pandemic. But what I'd suggest we maybe start to look at and unpack a bit further is what our faith means in amongst all of this. But maybe if I can just sort of pause there, and I'd be interested if people have any particular reflections maybe on, or have other perspectives and reflections that they've been having in amongst the pandemic. And maybe if you could raise a hand or something to say that perhaps Stephen could invite you in.
I think probably we have few questions so far, Ben. I've just sent you a quick message. We're losing you occasionally, and not all the time. And I think probably you've raced through a lot of stuff there, which has been very, very helpful. And I think probably as we pace it a bit as we go forward, because I think there's quite a lot for us to take in this time on a Saturday morning. And you're very used to actually sharing this at a pace where you're engaged and so on. So I think that this morning, although we have a time frame, I think there's plenty of time, dare I say, to cover the ground. Cover the ground that we need to cover this morning. So you've whizzed through a lot there, and I think you've probably sort of you've shaken up a few. It's a bit like stepping onto the fast lane in the gym. Not that I ever do it, as you know. But I think if we just sort of now go on, unless anyone's got any questions, I think to hear about how faith does relate to what you're saying, and just let's just enjoy what you're saying this morning. It's very, very challenging, and it will be. And we're keen to take away. It's good to see that it's being recorded. You agree to that, so we'll be able to listen to it at our leisure later as well. So unless anyone's got any urgent questions, I think if we could...
Dennis has to...
Dennis. Okay,
Dennis. Dennis, both put hands up.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Unmute Dennis.
Dennis, you're on mute.
You can hear me now, I think.
Yep.
Is that okay? Two observations, Ben, about the pandemic, and one maybe about faith. First thing, I personally think the attitude that we took at the beginning of the pandemic was completely wrong. The whole idea of stopping the economic life of the country is akin to committing economic suicide. I think the pain for so many people will be a great deal worse than the loss and the grief that's caused by death as a result of the pandemic. But people losing their jobs, their homes, their businesses, the debt that's going to be inflicted upon our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren is going to be absolutely huge. And I think the whole herd immunity idea, which got a lot of lambasting in the press, it was actually the right way forward. Now, I fully understand that politicians can't stand up and say, don't worry, people, we're going to let everybody die. Those who are going to die are going to die. And if you're lucky and you carry on living, that's fine. They can't say that, and I understand that. And I appreciate the desire to protect the NHS. The other aspect, coming out of the pandemic, such as we are so far, is that my observation is that people are going back to the way they lived very, very much as before, and they're kind of getting bored of being locked down, not unreasonably. And we are going to very quickly go back to exactly what we did previously, jumping in our cars, the whole thing about riding bicycles in the pandemic, or in the lockdown, I should say. It's going to very quickly disappear once the wetter weather comes in the winter. And I just wonder whether the optimistic view that you have of what you've just ascribed to is actually not going to happen. And I must admit, on the whole, I'm fairly gloomy about the future. The other thing to say with regard to faith is, why are people of faith frightened of dying? You're going to a better place, eternity, you're going to see all the people you were previously loved. Why are we afraid of dying? If the 70-odd years on this planet is, just that sort of testing ground, as it were, why would you bother about ending it? And that's a question I find very difficult to answer.
Thanks, Dennis. Really appreciate that. And some really thought-provoking questions there. And I think that while, clearly I'm not going to have all the answers, but maybe just to share a few reflections to join yours, is that, I think the thing about systemic risks and things like pandemics, and the same is true of things like climate change, is that it presents very difficult dilemmas. And I think what we've seen is that there aren't probably right answers. There are various implications of both options. And I think probably, I'm sure like you, just glad the politicians to make them. But I think when we look at some of the wider systemic issues, I think what it does for me when I reflect on is the earlier we prepare for them and the earlier we take measures, both the cheaper and the less the impact it has. And so what we're seeing is, if, for example, around climate change, is that the earlier we tackle it, the much cheaper it becomes to tackle it. The later we leave it, the more expensive, the bigger the impact. And the same is true actually of the pandemic. There's some quite staggering statistics that it would have taken, I think, 1 day of shutdown to have actually put in place the measures to have prevented it. And similarly, climate change, there's estimates that if you tackle it early, you're looking around about 1% of GDP. If you're looking later, it's more like 4, 5, 6% of GDP. And that was one of the points that Lord Stern raised in his Stern report on climate change, to say, look, the guys, the later we leave this, the harder it's going to get. And I think what the pandemic's done is accelerated a lot of those existential systemic questions we need to tackle as a society, ranging from how fast we need to decarbonize. I mean, just look at the debate around, should we be putting public money into funding, putting the aviation companies back into discuss, that's a social decision for us to make. So there are all of those sorts of dilemmas. Should we have a universal salary with automation on the horizon, wiping out 40 to 80% of jobs? So so it raises these systemic issues, which is, I think, also one of the reasons why organizations like ours and World Economic Forum are calling for a reset, to look at these in a totality rather than reactive sticking plasters. In terms of sort of mortality, well, I think there's far more qualified people on the call than me to answer that one. But I think my reflections are that I feel that it's not my place to decide when I go. That's the Lord's, and when my time's right, I'll be happy to not have much choice, go when He's ready, and I feel at peace with that. And actually, I feel that my faith has given me a great deal of peace during the pandemic. And so for me, and this partly comes back to the role of faith with creation, is that while we're here, I feel that I need to be 100% focused on saving people and creation as part of that mandate until my number's up. And until that point, I feel fully dedicated to that. So that's my own reflection. But I think there's, far more, as I say, deeper thinkers on the call. So should we just a nice segue into maybe the role of faith, and just going to be my charger while as we talk. But unless there are any other questions, Stephen.
Well, I think Les had one.
Okay.
Les?
Ben, I love your optimism at this time in the morning. I think I get increasingly pessimistic because what we've seen around the world is populists come into government and into leadership. News today about Brazil, Bolsonaro, and the burning of the Amazon rainforest. I hardly need to mention Trump. In our own country, we've now got Boris Johnson, people who are sit very loosely to truth, are deniers of some very obvious truths. And of course, are able to get away with it in our day and time because people curate their own news. They read what they want in social media rather than the old days when they would turn to the BBC or even in the days when the United States had some balanced media. People turn to the media that tells them what they want to hear. And of course, this means that climate change deniers have grown in number and have grown in strength, and actually were able to elect an American president. All of that, of course, alongside an economic system that is accelerating the climate change. And I think I agree with Dennis. The likely trajectory that those leaders will take us out of this pandemic is growth, 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 and that's what we hear: build, build, build. So we are looking at accelerating climate change as a result of the pandemic. And isn't it a question of saying, just as when the old feudal system came to the end of its useful life, that the capitalist system is coming to the end of its useful life, And Christians are the people who turn the world upside down, because we have a different set of values to those who are in power and control at the moment. And we need to turn the world upside down. We can't carry on with the current systems which are accelerating a race to oblivion. So I'm not an optimist like you, Ben.
Yeah, and
need
I think
optimists. That's the thing.
well, I think maybe we need sort of pragmatic optimists. So I think you're right that we need to face into those realities. And it's interesting. So I was listening to this call with Mark Carney, and he was asked essentially the same question with a populist backdrop. And his answer was interesting, because he was basically saying that, in a sense, a lot of these trends will be happening anyway. So, but where he saw more, he was saying basically the bottleneck is around investment. So he said that both from companies and capital markets, that's where I think the impact will come, is that governments need to be investing trillions of dollars for obvious reasons, and capital markets are sitting on trillions of dollars to invest as well. And they're looking for long-term investments. And so he thought that was actually one of the big major drivers of change. And when I look around, I don't take faith from politicians. I share that concern. I do take growing faith from capital markets and the next generation. So as particularly millennials, as they're starting to come into positions of power, that's where I take my optimism from. And the market signals in so many categories are shifting but at the moment nothing like fast enough. So just the level of speed of change is nothing like that. Now I'm just going to be might lose the camera just for a second, if you could just give me, because I'm just going to be logging into my computer in order to, so if you could just bear with me just a second. Unless, are there any other questions at this stage or reflections?
I've just got one point actually, but I don't want to distract from the conversation. I was just thinking that I think I raised this question before. If the world has lost a little bit of confidence in its leadership, do you think that, and given that sort of 90% of the world has a faith, or 95% of the world's population has a faith, do you think that people will turn more to faith leaders to give them some guidance in the future as opposed to politicians? It might be difficult in the Western world, but I was thinking more in the Asian side, where there's a strong adherence to faith, that faith leaders may become more prominent than politicians.
I think it's a really good question. Oh, hang on a sec. I just switched over. So, yeah, I think it's a really good question, because at the moment, I'd say that the faith community, as we know, is so influential. And I forget the proper name for it, but a few years ago, the Pope issued an edict on, as he does to all their sort of cardinals, on climate change. And it was extremely impressive. There's a really interesting write-up I heard actually comparing that to the Paris Agreement and saying, actually, it's far more systemic. It recognizes the interconnected nature of climate change with biodiversity loss and other issues we're facing as a society. And it was a really profound piece of writing. And so I think that's fantastic. So I think that, yeah, there is a huge opportunity for faith leaders. And I think now is the real time, because I think I touched on this when we last met, and this is that for me, it gets to the point that our current story isn't true. If you think of the globalization story, which is around economic growth, profit maximization, and a lot of that comes down to owning stuff. It's about materialism, and whether that's growth in GDP, whether that's growth in our own personal wealth, and so on. That's the story that tells that if you're rich, you're going to be happy. We all want to be apparently like Hollywood film stars and so on and so forth. And even they say they're not happy with it. You've even got, the richest billionaires in the world saying money doesn't make you happy. So what we've got is a story that's not true. We often refer to it as the hedonic treadmill, this idea that, and I think it's tragic that you travel the world, as you know you will have done as well, and you talk to people in remote parts of the world, and they want to live like Westerners. They want the Western dream, and so this hedonic treadmill is that people have got it, want more of it, and I think if you talk to somebody, last year I met my first sort of multi-billionaire for the first time, and they want more of it, because they've got 10 billion, but their friend's got 20 billion and they want that, those who've got some of it want more of it. Those that haven't got it want it. and those that will never have it dream of having it. So that's the sort of the current Western dream. And I think, as I say, the story isn't true. And I think that as Christians, we hold another narrative, and I think the world desperately needs that. And when I heard Rowan Williams talk on climate change, he, I think, rightly said that fundamentally climate change is a spiritual crisis, that it's not just a market crisis. What's underlying that need for growth, approval, materialism is a spiritual hunger, spiritual hunger for love and connectedness. And I think that, and I agree with that. So I think that if we just treat this as an economic issue or even a political one, I don't think we're really going to get to the roots of what that global narrative is and what the alternative is, which maybe is a segue into exploring, I believe, the richness that our faith brings to this. But
Sure.
I think, great question. It often just doesn't come up often enough in the debate, actually. I very rarely hear the spiritual community as a player in this whole debate.
Sure. Well, yeah.
But let's hear about the faith dimension then.
Cool. Can you hear me okay now?
We've got you in stereo, actually.
Yeah.
Bring on it.
There we go.
So I was just switching from one device to another. Apologies, the battery's running low. So you can hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah. Fine.
Super. So I thought I'd just share with you some of the insights. When I was at Holy Trinity Brompton in London, we spent some time developing a creation course which looked at the relationship between these big trends and our faith. And I wanted to share some of the sort of insights that came from that. And so I think the first one is that if we look at passages in the Bible like Psalm 24 verse 1, it says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." So the first is this idea of good news that of course the world, we feel as Christians, was created by God. And so is there just for our
I've got some.
our play doing something else. It's all part of the creation and blessings that God's given us. And so I think that's sort of the first, and that it's loved by God as well. So in John 3 verse 16, God so loved the world. He used the Greek term cosmos, which is rather like an artist's passion for his art. And so God goes to extraordinary lengths in Christ to demonstrate his love for creation. And so I think that's something that for me is also deeply profound, which is that rather than sort of this idea that we as human beings are sort of somehow plonked on this rather indifferent and arbitrary planet, that seems strange to me when it's clearly so beautiful. And so the idea that we're part of that creation, part of this, beautiful planet that we've been given to live on, seems just, for me, it resonate. But the challenge, I think, comes, which is that I think also what God's calling for is that we have a responsibility towards that creation. So if we look at Genesis 2, verse 15, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Hebrew words refer to serving the garden and keeping it. And so there's that sort of active sense of responsibility. And so I think we also see that coming through as well. And there's also a calling for a renewal of creation as well. So Romans 8, verse 19, the creation waits in eager expectation of the children of God to be revealed. And so I think that we start to see that idea of renewal and restoration isn't just about Jesus coming to save us, but that we have a responsibility which ties into our inextricable relationship with creation as well. It's all bound up as part of that. So I think, as I say, for me, therefore, that the Christian focus, which is I've always felt is summed up as really around love that we first feel that God feels for us, And through that sort of revelation of that love and what the extent he's gone to send Jesus and to bring us back into close love with him, then spills out onto those around us through our communities, our churches, and so on. For me, there's always that sort of image of, at weddings when they have those towers of champagne glasses and they pour the top one, it all cascades down into other ones. And for me, that's a real sort of demonstration of how I always feel like there's God, pouring the Holy Spirit into the glass at the top, which then cascades down and flows into the other glasses, which are a bit like, the other people in our community, be in church and beyond. And so that sort of is, as I say, is extended. That's really, if it's really around love, it's about sort of a connection with the relationships. And so that, and Nicky Gumbel at HTB, I think, summed it up well, where he said it's really about, loving others and using things, not loving things and using people, putting it very bluntly. And so and I find that sort of is a nice summary. So, and really captures that fundamental truth that the best things in life are free. And so I think for me, that's the real depth of what our faith brings, is a way of bringing in, if you like, writing the story. So removing ourselves from the story which isn't true and replacing it with another narrative of love and restoration and grace. That's my sort of, reflections. But I'd be interested in perhaps, and so if in that case, what does that mean in terms of the, some of these big trends? I think that it does provide an alternative narrative. It provides an alternative way to move us beyond just looking at economic growth, profit maximization. And one of the areas I'm really involved in is this whole rising of the issue around purpose, for example. So I don't know if you've been following, but last year the Business Roundtable, so this organization that represents like 200 of the US's biggest company CEOs, came out with a statement which put forward that the purpose of business, they feel, has shifted for the first time since the sort of Milton Friedman consensus, back in the 70s, which said that the role of business was to maximize profit for shareholders and everything else was the role of government to set the rules of the game. They put forward a view which is actually that the role of business is to generate value for all of its stakeholders, including shareholders. But also, I think, recognizing that there's that relationship between the creation of value, both through natural resources and social resources, actually are dependent on the financial value creation as well. So it's also saying, getting back to what is the purpose of business? What's the purpose of organizations? And I think if we start to get to that and say, how are those organizations really contributing to a sustainable future, which allows people to flourish, enables the loving and flourishing of each other, and what's the unique contribution that organization is able to bring, starts to, I think, reorientate both potentially value propositions, creating new markets, and starts to create that alignment that I think Mark Carney was talking about between both the societal shift that's needed with the strategic shift that's needed within a business. So that's where we're starting to connect through this idea of purpose. What is both that, and then allowing both individuals to be thinking about what is actually my purpose, what's my unique gifting that I'm bringing to the world, and allowing us as individuals to then say, well, what organizations am I feeling aligned to, where I'm sharing the values and sense of purpose that I can really help put my shoulder to the wheel in enabling those organizations in turn bring about the kind of future that we want. So that's maybe just a way of starting to bring it back to sort of organizations that we work in, sectors we work in. There's obviously a lot more that could be said around that, but I want to just maybe pause there. I'd be really interested in your reflections as in terms of how you think about your faith in the context of these sort of global challenges. So yeah, maybe if I just pause there, and maybe you can either raise a hand, or I think we've got reaction buttons at the bottom of your screen. I think you can raise a hand. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks, Brad. That's very helpful. Also challenging. As we start to come out of we think the pandemic, and yet we know there's a lot of issues ahead. Let's be practical about this. How because there's a range of ages here, different stages. Some not fully engaged, some more than fully engaged in work. How do you yourself look to the Lord to lead you with what you do, because we're all. In my column this morning, it says how the Lord led Israel in a howling wilderness. He led him about. He instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye, and believing that's his eye upon us, and he's instructing us. I believe even this morning. How do we grasp this to be able to obviously pray into it, to pray for that shift that you've talked about in life, thinking of our grandchildren and what they'll be seeing in 50 years' time? How it says in the word, doesn't it, that the rudder in a boat can turn great ships. What is the rudder we're looking for here from your perspective, practically?
Thanks, Stephen. So I took sort of maybe two things. So one, maybe it sounds like how does that play out for me? How do I act out my faith? And
that's part of it.
And then what does that mean for us, as it more widely, maybe as a group, as individuals, where they sort of lever points so we can have an impact? Is that fair?
Yeah, well, that's well said. So
I think for me, one of the things I feel very lucky is that it feels like my job really aligns with my sense of calling and faith. So I think that's the first thing. I feel really grateful that, and incredibly privileged, particularly where I am at the moment, incredibly privileged to be where I am. I sort of go into situations, I think, oh my goodness, how on earth did I find myself in this situation? But I think that one of the books I guess I found really helpful is The Purpose-Driven Life. I'm sure Rick Warren's book that you'll be familiar with, and I found that very helpful too. But I've always been very passionate about purpose, going back to my backgrounds in philosophy and ethics, and very influenced by the Greeks and so on. But that whole idea of flourishing and trying to get a handle on what are the gifts that we've been given, how do we align those gifts with what the world needs, and that sort of virtuous circle of both feeling that, and this is, I think, one of the pieces of the narrative coming through around the purpose, is that the macro purpose is around increasing well-being in the wider sense, and I often see that through the idea of flourishing. Us, that idea in John, of we live life in all its fullness. We are the most that we have been made to be by God. So me at my most Ben, whatever that looks like. So identifying those gifts and utilizing them in the service of what society needs. And I think the outline I've given is, as ever, I think as Christians, what the world needs is often really clear. That's not hard to find. As ever, it's sort of the harvest is great and the workers are few, right? I think the more challenge for people is around saying, well, what's my gifting? What's my unique contribution to all of this? And I personally find it's a combination of trial and error and praying and asking the Holy Spirit. And that the sort of cycle, and trying to reflect on that and being honest about what is and isn't working. And often what I find, I've been in your experience, but is often it's less about, it's often having the courage to listen to that quiet voice inside, that quiet voice. Often I find it's that word, I feel it comes from God, where it's that sort of wisdom, intuition. And often it speaks very gently, and it's having the courage to sometimes follow that in career paths, in jobs, in projects I might take on, and so on. So that's broadly kind of, I guess, how I see that piece around my alignment with my role. In terms of the impact we can have, well, there is, I can share on chat actually, there is a fantastic footprint calculator you can use, which essentially asks you not many questions, and it'll basically go through the big major impact areas in our lives, which I'll summarize in a moment. And you can fill it out and it will tell you what your impact is, using a concept which is one planet living. So it's this idea that if everybody in the planet lived like our lifestyle, and you extrapolated that across the current 7.6 billion, how many planets would we need? How many resources from natural planets would we need to sustain that? So I think the average Brit at the moment lives around about about 4 or 5 planets, and the average American is around about 6 or 7, if everybody lived like them. So I can send that link, so that will help you. And the broad impact areas is our housing. So the materials that went into our house, how well insulated it is, the energy that's used to run our homes. So that's kind of one big impact area. Second big impact area is transportation. So how much we travel, how we travel, and what we travel in. So how often do we take flights? What kind of, do we take public transport? What kind of cars do we drive, and so on and so forth. Another big area is the food that we eat. So it's less about how much we eat, but it's the type of food we eat and where it comes from, how it's sourced, and what happens to it. Because on average, we waste around about a third of the food that we grow globally. And broadly speaking, the more vegetable and fruit-based diets tends to be both the more healthfully, interestingly, and the more sustainable. So there's that side of things. And then there's the sort of the things we buy. So essentially our consumption from computers, clothes, and so on. Again, how much we buy, what happens to them after we buy them, do we recycle them, do we throw them away, and so on. So they tend to be the kind of the big impact areas when you look at one's life. And the link I can give you will give you a footprint. It'll tell you, are you living a 1 planet life, a 5 planet life, and so on. And it will give you recommendations on steps you can take. But I would say, in summary, if I'm honest, probably there's two things that would have the most impact, particularly where we are right now. And actually, all it would take is dropping an email. First one is writing to your local MP. So it's about using that democratic, leverage. And I'm in regular contact with our local MP. Bim's a great guy. He's actually one of the really progressive, MPs within the government. And he's been really open, and we have a running dialogue. And anyway, which is, I'm very blunt with him. I'm very challenging with him, and he's very honest and frank. So anyway, I think there's that. If we don't tell him and use that democratic right at this critical moment, so that would be probably one of the most impactful things you can do. The second one is essentially writing to your asset manager, whoever's looking after your savings, pension funds, and so on, and asking them a letter, sending them a letter. And you could ask both them and BIM some very simple questions, such as, are you investing in a future that I and others want to retire into? Are you, investing in companies that are creating a future which is aligned with my values? Are you investing in companies that are delivering a 1.5 degree world as committed to by Paris, in the Paris Agreement internationally, and that, deliver on the, net zero targets by mid-2050 that both the UK and the European Union have voted on as a democratic body? Are your portfolios in line with those outcomes? And just even asking some of those simple questions, I can pretty much guarantee they won't have an answer, or they certainly won't have a robust one. But they, I think, are probably, if I'm honest, the two most impactful things that probably you and we can do, as well as, of course, and sometimes I think it is about asking the difficult questions. And so it's not necessarily always about telling people what to do, but it's asking them.
Yes.
And if we don't ask, it doesn't provoke this sort of thinking and so on. So there'll be maybe a few suggestions. And while we maybe open up to other reflections, perhaps I'll just drop this link into the chat box in case you're curious to find out what your footprint is.
You'll see in the chat box a question that where Les has drilled down even further, which is worth just looking at, if you could just pick that up. But I think, yes, I think BIM, very reactive. He was to me just this week on something. So certainly not one to hold back on. And the thought of the pension funds, that's an interesting one as well, really. Again, it's like the tail that wags the dog in a sense, and yet someone has to be the tail.
Great, yeah. And also,
sorry.
Yeah, I just think some great questions there. And so, Les, yeah. So the best things are the best things in life for accept in a monastic sense. Love is costly. Accepting God has bias to the poor and needy is challenging for those of us who are comfortable. Absolutely, really, really, very good point. Well made, Les. And I think that's that sense of in this that it's often relationships and appreciating natural beauty, of course. But as you say, when we're really engaged with that sort of sacrificial love, absolutely, absolutely right. And So actually, yeah, really interesting point about sort of Extinction Rebellion, and how does that get through to the similar youth in who've been visiting beaches and beauty spots and leaving all their litter. Yeah, and I think that, you know, it's a really interesting point, and it's been terrible what's been happening, and not only that, but also how people have been causing fires by using, you know, barbecues and so on. And I think this is tricky. You know, we are fickle people as human beings, aren't we? You know, and that we've got people responding to, understandably, coming out of the pandemic, and sort of going fast and loose, although it's absolutely no excuse in that context. And also, it's easy to overstate the young generation. I think while there are certainly clear both in terms of career paths, we're seeing, you know, a lot of evidence. It's starting to develop the evidence base, certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence from businesses that have developed sustainable purposes and are pursuing them. They're hearing all the time that the people they're recruiting into the business, particularly younger people, are saying, I'm joining your business because of the sustainability strategy it's taken. It's really important to me. You know, yes, I want a career. Yes, I want to be, remunerated, but I'm looking for a business I can feel proud to work for, and not apologetic to work for them. And they're wanting ideally both, but they're willing to make trade-offs. So that's the other interesting thing. They're willing to make trade-offs for salary, to work for businesses that are, have a purpose they can align to. So we are seeing that evidence coming through. We're seeing evidence coming through in buying patterns. So if you look in sort of most categories, certainly sort of food, personal care, home care, and so on, the really fast-growing category and brands are those that are credibly bringing sustainability benefits, and there's a clear pattern, and towards things like flexitarianism, veganism. We're seeing rapid growth in things, you know, these amazing technologies that basically deliver meat, but they're not meat. Looks, smells, taste just like meat, but it's made with using, precision fermentation technologies. Just incredible. And these businesses are exploding, and they're being acquired by big food companies rapidly. So we are seeing those fundamental shifts, and still, a lot of young people on, fast fashion, and so on and so forth, operating in really unsustainable ways as well. So I think really important not to get too carried away by the idea that, all the younger generation are all over this. Clearly an oversimplification. Yeah, so millennials polarized like the rest of society. A large number of are convinced by social media that the pandemic is a conspiracy, e.g. 5G, so they need not comply to lockdown. That was from Les. Yeah. And I think with social media, it's a major issue, isn't it, about where we're getting truth from? Another major issue. So yeah, any other sort of reflections? I've been to if you've either got things you're seeing going on out there in the world, or indeed for your own sense of your faith, and how that perhaps might inform or your sense of how it addresses some of these global challenges that we're facing, and how you find your place within in response to those. Oh, Simon, I think you're on mute, are you?
There we go. It's interesting that this lockdown period has preempted perhaps a lot more interest in maybe not sustainability, but basically when things were in short supply. I think a lot of people realised that we don't need as much things as we do, and I think that's spearheaded things. But the concern I have is that it was mentioned before, it's not going to last, and people are just going to sort of move on. I think, ecologically and so forth, there's a whole lot of benefits from this lockdown period. Pollution in the sea, and animals being sort of surviving differently, and habitats regrowing. But it's short-lived, isn't it? I mean, it's a great opportunity, but if this doesn't kickstart everything, I just don't know how politicians are going to get it through, because this is enforced. The COVID lockdown was enforced, whereas politicians are delivering the message that has to be adhered to. There's no. It's just I just hope that the world has learned a little bit from what we need and what we don't need, in particularly. Without rambling.
It's a really good reflection, Simon. A couple of further triggers a few other reflections. So I think one of the things that seems to be coming out of it is a deep sense of reflection over the pandemic, because in a sense we've been forced to, right? We've been given up a whole load of things. We're fasting, in a form of fasting, and a lot of people have had a time for reflection. Some haven't. Some have been rushed off their feet, of course. But at a number of levels, I think, isn't it? It's both at a personal level, you know, when you've been deprived of things, it makes you question, actually, do I value, you know, jetting off to Spain on holiday, or, you know, whatever it might be, or how important is it to go down the pub, or obviously very, but, you know, but whatever those might be. And so at a personal level, also at that societal level, that suddenly we're seeing, and to put into context, so we, in order to remain on track for the Paris Agreement, we need to be decarbonising globally around about 7.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions a year. We think possibly, as coming out of the pandemic, that we're going to be on track for around about that, maybe 8%, 7.5%, in that ballpark. But it gives you the idea of just how dramatic, you know, that we've gone through to achieve that. Now, of course, that's the trouble with the pandemic. It doesn't get us out of the dilemma, which is how do we both deliver standard of living and do it within environmental limits. That's it doesn't get us. All we've done is just, you know, we've just given up, you know, obviously economic activity, as Dennis was saying, at the expense of. So it's just gone from one side of the dilemma to the other. It hasn't resolved the dilemma. So I think that deep questioning, and that's one of the things that I think also is different to the banking crisis, which was, it was a lot of people, you and I, bailing out a very few number of people, which was, you know, people in the City of London. And otherwise then life went back to normal. This isn't. This is everybody bailing everybody out. And we've all been affected by the pandemic. So I think that depth of reflection does seem to be quite profound. And also, some people have been saying, you know, do we want to go back to normal, when the reality is that normal wasn't working for most people in the world? You know, it was creating, you know, climate change, which was, you know, devastating the lives of most people, particularly the poor. You know, it was, and so on, and leading to great inequalities and all those, you know, trends I talked about. The other interesting piece of research was that Futera did some, which is a sort of agency in London, looking at, they're polling around about 1,000 US and UK citizens, and what they found was really interesting. So they asked them, would you be willing to make similar sort of drastic lifestyle changes we've made under the pandemic to tackle global challenges like climate change? Over 80%, I think it was like 84, 85% said yes. But the real interesting part is this next question they asked them, which is, if you made those changes, would it increase or decrease your quality of life? And interestingly, they all, again, very high percentages said it would increase our quality of life in the process. So really interesting that I think that we are seeing this really big divide, I think, opening up between where, if you like, civil society is and the existential concerns that civil society is, and where our policymakers and, you know, business are. We're seeing a really big gap, and that I think demonstrates that. I think we've seen some really interesting stuff. So Harold, you've let me take in. So younger people follow causes rather than organisations. Yeah, how do we reconcile that?
Sorry, I meant those to be separate. They've all gone in one.
Yeah, and then the PPE around, the pandemic leads to lots of PPE and really interesting point about the sort of so Howard, about the idea that the NHS actually had too low capacity in the first place, rather than just for
I mean, that's essentially an issue that government needs to tackle in terms of what are its social and moral priorities. Is there enough capacity to help the people that need to be helped, or are there priorities in other areas that are less important in terms of the fundamentals we are believing in, which is, as you said, God so loved the world.
Yeah.
But there's also the economy as well. That's the thing. That's the council side, isn't it?
It is. And I think that's one of the other interesting reflections, isn't it? How clearly the role of core workers, including particularly the NHS, has obviously become very high profile. And I think what will be interesting is to see what lasting impact that has, and how we, as a society, invest in and treat those core workers will be, I think, interesting to see. And I think also reflects part of that sort of wider systemic challenges. Because I look around systems, and I don't know about you, I struggle to find a system that isn't looking fundamentally broken. You know, we know, of course, the NHS as we've become a sort of a fantastically living longer, but clearly that's putting, you know, a larger drawdown on the NHS, and we know, and so all of those systemic issues, not least like climate change, is all part of it. Feels like that sort of, we're putting sticking plasters on outdated systems rather than having a fundamental rethink and saying, actually, what do our systems need in order to be resilient, and what are those systems in the service of? You know, is it just growth? And I think, if I'm honest, I think that what we don't, or what often the backdrop narrative is that because we have a democratic system, broadly the balance between society and business and so on is about right, and if not, our politicians would fix it. And broadly think that sort of feels like the backdrop. And I just don't think that's true. You know, I think that we have such a discrepancy that if you look at actually where most of value created by society does go to 1%. It's actually less than 1%. It's more like a small percentage of 1%. And so I think we're not bringing that into the debate. I think so. We tend to end up with should we tax a bit more to fund the NHS, which just feels really tactical. I don't think really is addressing those sort of wider the geopolitical realities that we are now kind of in. Now that's not straightforward because, of course, we've got global corporates that can move outside of domestic policy, and so on. But I think we need to see it in that wider frame, which is because I think it was in 2017. I think it was around about 84% of global GDP went to single-figure percentages of the global population. So, which comes back to that enormous inequality. And I think we need to face into that. We need to start to bring that, I think, into debate and ask the question: where is global GDP going? Quite controversial. It's a big question to unpack, but I thought worth putting that in context. So, Dennis, thanks. In survey responses are often right or best, but folks don't vote the same way. I'd love to pay more tax for NHS, but never vote for higher taxes. Interesting, yeah.
But the NHS one has been solved by reimposing parking charges on the NHS staff when they go into work. So that'll soon pay for itself.
Great.
Yeah. And we're a fickle bunch, aren't we? Because similarly, I know marketeers I work with, and they get frustrated because often they'll talk to consumers and consumers will say, "Oh yeah, I'd buy more sustainable products," but then we're actually at the shelf and the decision point. They don't always do, but that's human nature, right? So any other sort of?
Isn't Ben in this debate about the NHS a very good illustrator of the way in which our value systems are now out of kilter, both with Christian values and with a necessary survival strategy. We live with a government that believes that you can judge the value of a profession by the salary that it attracts, and they're trying to impose this on the university system to select out courses which lead to highly paid jobs, and say, therefore, they are the highest quality ones, the ones that we as a nation need. Yet the pandemic has shown us that, in fact, the people we need are in social care and extremely poorly paid. In the NHS, many of whom are poorly paid. Our value system is out of kilter with what we need. And that, of course, is true in the environmental debate. What we value we admire people with the big yacht and the private jet, and actually that's out of kilter with the value system that we require for survival. And if we look at the United States, and I do because throughout my life this country has followed the United States. If we look at the United States, then because of the great discrepancies in wealth there, the rich very much control the political system. You ask yourself, why on earth do you get such poor quality politicians coming forward in the US? And the answer is because it's money that talks in the US. And we've entered a world now, and it has come to this country, where politics is not about ideology anymore. It's not about the programs that people want to introduce. It's about the personalities, and it's about retaining power. And that's why the response to the pandemic was the way it was. If the NHS had collapsed, it would have been political oblivion for Boris Johnson. And so everything was done to make sure that the NHS didn't collapse, despite chronic underfunding for the last few years. So it's I think you're absolutely right in pointing to the value system. That is what we have got to, and that is where we as Christians can take a stand, because we have a value system that's given us in the Bible. It consists of that bias towards the poor that God has. The Old Testament speaks very clearly about how society should be with regard to the foreigner and the needy, and we have gone a long way from that in our society.
A really, really good point, Les, and it makes me reflect on a couple of things. Is that, first of all, I think one of the things I've been struck by, I remember seeing some research which asked people from a range of countries, what's really important to you? And what's really striking is the consistency. You know, whether you're talking to families in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, the US, Europe, Asia, and so on, you get the same things coming back. No surprise, it's health, it's education, you know, it's decent jobs and so on. You know, they're not saying I want to, you know, yacht in Marbella necessarily. It's, you know, those sorts of. So I think often I think maybe our values are perhaps closer than we sometimes think they are, but aren't necessarily reflecting our current economic model. And I heard a great talk by a professor, I think she's at LBS, and I can share the podcast if you're interested. But she was getting to this sort of fundamental misalignment of how we price value in our economy. And she was pointing to how, because we're kind of currently in sort of late, you know, neoliberal economic model at the moment, what that does is that uses price signals to determine value. And so she said that as a result of that, you know, you've got, hence, you know, after the banking crisis, one of the MDs, one of the big global banks turned around and said, you know, my team deliver more to society than anybody else. You think, hang on a minute, you know. And what he was getting at was, in a sense, articulating that economic truth, which is they're the most highly paid people in society. Ergo, they're delivering more value than everybody else. You know, and that he's just reflecting the kind of classic neoclassical economic model, which is basically saying that we're using price signals to determine value. Full stop. And so we roll that up at a national level at GDP, and then we roll it down at capital markets, and we roll it down to you know, financial reporting at company level, and we roll it down to salaries at a personal level. And so you're right, we're using this sort of as a metric, which actually I think doesn't value full value creation. She was pointing to, for example, that it means that we're very poor as a society at showing the value created by particularly, say, the public sector. So she used the example of, for example, some research that might have come out of a lab in a university, which then leads to a cure for a disease or a new drug or something like that. We really can't. We don't know how we can price that value into that drug, for example, or let's say take the value that teachers provide. You know, how do we really price that in? Not only the education, but also through that education, we're now lowering crime. So because we're lowering crime, we've now got, you know, lower, you know, we're paying less on policing and so on and so forth, all of those knock-on effects. We can't price that into our current economic model. And curious things like, you know, if you marry your au pair, GDP drops, you know, because what was the paid care service now isn't paid because she's your wife, not your, you know, au pair, for example. And so that also shows how, you're right, a lot of value is being created, particularly in the care sector, either because staff not necessarily always being paid enough, but also that sort of unpaid care as well, all of which is creating value for society, but doesn't appear in GDP, doesn't appear in our, you know, financial capital markets. So I think you're right. What she's pointing to is this paucity and inadequacy in just using price signals to reflect all of value creation. And that's, again, coming back to what Mark Carney was saying, is that what's lying at the heart of the climate crisis is that we're not pricing in that value creation. You know, we're let's say, you know, the fossil fuel industry they've been able to, sell petrochemicals and without being charged the emissions for all of those. So all of those, global greenhouse gases that come out of us, burning fossil fuels, isn't priced into, either adequate to the pump or your BP shares, whatever. I'm not necessarily having a, particular dig at the fossil fuel industry, because they're part of a much bigger system and a part of a bigger economic model. But I agree, it comes back to this point. Our price signals aren't reflecting full value creation in society, and therefore not reflecting our values as both citizens and civil society. Yeah, thanks, Mark. So Mark's reflecting the paradox is that capitalism, which in many respects is terrible, has helped many millions in China, India and others to come out of poverty. And agreed. And I think what a lot of people are saying is we need to rebuild capitalism. Capitalism can take many forms. And so, and I think that is the question we have. And I think we touched on it last time, wasn't it? Somebody asked, is capitalism broken? Can we ever fix it? I do think we need to talk about the type of capitalism and realize that we are actually in quite an extreme form of capitalism at the moment. I mean, some of the inequality levels we're facing, you have to go back to the sort of Edwardian period to find similar levels of inequality, which again are in the background. We just don't bring this into the debate. And what I think the movement towards is around this sort of idea of having a more fuller sense of value creation metrics, is a way of using market signals to start to make corrections in the market. So, and to correct these market failures and market inefficiencies. And from both at a national level, having other indicators around GDP for things like wellness, things like life satisfaction, mental health and so on, to have a more rounded picture of value creation, as well as at the business level. And a lot of the work we're being involved in is this idea of integrated reporting, where businesses are not just reporting on the money they're making, but they're also showing what sort of social and environmental value they've created or destroyed in the process of creating that, so that investors and other stakeholders can understand how fit for the future they are, how resilient they are to these sort of, global trends. Like, are they massively exposed to, climate change, for example, and so on, to allow them to make informed choices, which then you can bring market signals in to bear and putting a price on those. So whether it's a carbon price and so on. So there's this idea that if we modify capitalism, correct these market failures, we can actually allow those market signals to redeploy capital and resources more appropriately. So that's, I think, the main idea. But as one writer sort of put it, we somehow feel that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It seems so resilient. Harold, thanks for replying. Do you want to reflect on that? Anything you want to add to that, Harold, to your reply to Mark?
No, just to underline it, a lot of people have been helped. A lot of people are left struggling in the wake, and it's not fair for some people to achieve by climbing on the shoulders and the bodies of others and pushing them further down into the mud. I've seen it, having visited India a few years ago. I'm still in touch with John and Abu, who work at the Chalk Face. We heard from them a couple of weeks ago at Woolsworth Road. And it's happening elsewhere. It is not reasonable. The gap is widening. That's the system as it stands. You're right, it needs readjustment of the values by which these assessments are being made to bring about benefit for all, and not just for a few or even for a half, if it's at the price of the other half.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Stephen.
I think as we draw towards a close in this, Ben, not quite there yet, but just to, if I may bring a different shift here, you referred to the God's passion for his world. And, I thought then of Paul's passion and how much of what we focus on in the West, and we talked about the markets, if we didn't have salaries, if they suddenly stopped, it's when you lose something. It's when you lose something that your value system gets a shake up. So often when you've lost something, then you truly value it. And yet Paul was to say, my background, academia, everything that I considered so important, which really conditioned my value system, I now consider rubbish for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I've lost all things. And I wonder if he were to join our conversation and listen to where we men have our mindsets, whatever our idol is. You know, we maybe don't realize it. It may be the NHS. How much that's an idol for so many. It may be our bank balance. It may be pension. It may be salary. Whatever. It may be work today. Family. And I just wonder whether, as we draw to a close, there's also that need just to have that postscript almost, thinking, well, okay, you know, it's when you die to self. It's that seed that's buried in the ground. We need to have that mindset where really everything else is secondary to our relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the only reason we're here today in reality, because he's drawn us to himself. So I think I think maybe it's a postscript on this really valuable time this morning. Just to think, yes, as we reach that point, to have his perspective, to see with his eyes, when our conditioning so often is from our backgrounds and where we are, to have our eyes opened to what he is doing today, not what the enemy is doing today. What is he doing? Is this time just a foreshadowing of tougher times to come? We don't know. We're hearing you saying it is in many ways. If it is a foreshadowing, we need to be grasping where we are today and hearing what he's saying to us. And that's my passion. Lord, open our eyes. What are you saying to us in this time of pandemic? It's no surprise to you. It's no surprise to you where the markets are at. Some of them in this meeting are well off and some are not. Some of them in our church are well off and some are not. Lord, what is your balance? Not what is our balance. So I just wanted to chip that in terms of the of that perspective that Paul had learned that. Have I learned that? I don't think so. So much to learn, isn't there still?
Mm. Thanks, Stephen. I think that's really rich, and thank you for, as you say, it's refocusing, because I think we've talked, as Les pointed out, about values, and I think you're right that it's, for me, it absolutely is anchored in the demonstration that, you know, not surprisingly, Jesus got it right. You know, as you say, that's what it's all about. That's where everything flows from that, as ever. And it's a really nice, you know, sort of bring us back to that, Stephen. So thank you.
Shall we bring things to a close now? Anybody else? We've got literally about 2 minutes before others have to go on and do various. We said 10 o'clock prompt stop. We're approaching 10 o'clock.
The only point I would add, Stephen, is probably a discussion in its own right, is I've wrestled with contentment, where maybe we need to realise when are we content and when we're not, and how much do we pursue, you know, personal gains and personal, you know, that's the thing I've wrestled with. I should be content, but anyway, it's a story for another day.
You want to learn, maybe next time.
Yeah.
Jeff had a quick point.
Yeah, I'm just saying a similar thing, I think, to what Simon has just said. There'd been a huge number of thoughts swimming around in my mind throughout this session, and need to get my head around it. But yeah, where are our values? Where are the government's values when they say, "Oh, well, there's a penny or two of income tax"? You know, whoopee. But actually, I've always felt we need to pay more tax. If we want decent services, the NHS, etc., we actually need to pay for it. So where are actually our values? Where do they actually lie?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
And maybe it brings us back to sort of the idea of peace and grace. And I know we need to come into land. I did just want to say I've really enjoyed being with you. It's been a real sort of real pleasure, and also for your humility, because I don't bring all the answers. You know, you guys have got huge insights and experience. It's a really complex, fast-moving debate. So thank you for your sort of patience and generosity with allowing me to join you for this morning as well. Stephen, over to you.
Well, Ben, thank you very much for coming in from West Sussex. And you could be in Mars today, but you're only in West Sussex. It's been rich, a really rich time. I think we'd all agree that. And we normally stand and clap right now, but I think as Christian men, I'm going to just invite Andrew to bring this time to a close, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind.
Many thanks, Ben, for being with us, as we just put in the chat, and we pray for Ben now, Lord, as we thank you both for his contribution and his insight as he shared it with us so clearly and so eloquently, and we pray your blessing upon him, not just on this birthday weekend away, but on his work of influence and of engagement with people at the highest levels of business, both nationally and internationally. Lord, this is a man after your own heart, but a man that is able to influence at the highest levels. And we just pray your equipping, enabling and blessing of him. And we pray for each other, that each of us are valued in your sight, each of us are loved and treasured, and that we too will be able to play our part in the agenda as it continues to unfold. Lord God, we seek your blessing in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thanks, Ben. Thank you, Andrew, for hosting it too. And thank you guys for all coming. And until next time.